ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary citizens. Alex here. I'm here with George, oboist, composer, and professional elite dog spotter. Hey George, how are you?
I'm good, Alex. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So today, to show the formulaic nature of female representation in what is generally considered opera's golden period, from Mozart to Verdi, I will be giving the titles of operas at random, and we will be explaining how the female roles function dramatically and musically. So George, why don't you begin by telling us some of the similarities in Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni and La Gioconda by Ponchielli.
Okay, so these are two operas from the Verismo period, basically. Ponchielli was actually Puccini's teacher, and Puccini is perhaps one of the most well-known Verismo composers. Mascagni was around the same time as Puccini, and they were both very popular in their time. So musically, the female roles are set for a pretty dramatic Fach. They're both set for spinto soprano, which is basically as heavy a voice as you get in Italian opera repertoire. Dramatically, both of the roles have to do with the idea of a female waiting and basically the idea of being betrayed. In both operas, there's a woman who is in love with a man and somewhat committed to him, and the man leaves and comes back, and in both cases has found another woman. What a lot of people forget is that Verismo, although it basically means realism and it's about the music and the storylines attempting to portray life how it really is, I think that musically and even dramatically, a lot of the female roles can be compared to female roles in the operas of Wagner. I think that there's a sort of mythical aspect to the roles of the main women in both of these operas. The idea of a woman in waiting we see throughout history. You can see it in the Iliad with Penelope waiting for Ulysses to return from his voyage and being faithful the entire time, no matter what he does, and he ends up cheating on her a lot. Or in Medea, where Medea is waiting for the prince Jason, and he, once he comes back, he's actually married to another woman. In both of these operas, the main female lead is in this sort of situation of waiting, and the husband comes back, and husband or significant other in another light comes back and is with another woman. And both of these roles, they could be superficially compared to other operas of this time period, like Madame Butterfly, where Butterfly is waiting for her husband to come back and he returns with a wife. But I think in the case of Butterfly, this is a very sort of pathetic and earnest role. Once her husband comes back and is married, she feels as if she doesn't have a purpose anymore, so at the end of the opera she commits suicide. In these two operas, there is an aria from La Gioconda that's literally called Suicide, where the main character is sort of contemplating killing herself, but it's not because her lover left her for another person. She actually ended up being very happy for him for that. It's because another man was trying to get with her that she didn't want. She wanted to preserve her honor. But anyways, the way these two operas, the main female roles in Cavalleria and Gioconda differ from Butterfly is that not only is the voice type required for the role a lot heavier, the reactions of these women, I would say, is more similar to Medea than it would be to Penelope, in that there's a sense of pleading and anger, both musically and dramatically, in both of the roles. There are arias in both in which the dynamic range is mostly on the higher end.
That's a great answer, George. Thanks. I wanted to ask you the relationship between Cavalleria Rusticana and Rigoletto, and in the sense how their male counterparts work in relation to their female main roles.
That's a very, very interesting question, Alex. No question has an answer. So I guess the reason both of these operas are so popular, especially Rigoletto, is because of the hyperbolic nature of the gender binary in both operas. In Rigoletto, the male roles are very outwardly womanizing and sort of playboy-like and in nature, and Cavalleria, by contrast, or maybe by comparison, the title literally translates to rustic chivalry, so they're both sort of centered on the idea of like a self-awareness that masculinity in a lot of ways is a farce, and the women end up getting very hurt in both of these operas as a result. If you look at the famous tenor arias in Rigoletto, for instance, there's Questo Quello, in which the Duke of Mantua is basically describing all of the women he's been with, similar to how Don Giovanni, how his sort of helper's aria works in the opera Don Giovanni. He's just sort of explaining how he gets women left and right and has no trouble with women. But then later sings the very famous La Donna Immobile, in which he is basically blaming women for all of the misfortunes in his love life, even though he literally previously sung about being a serial cheater. So yeah, that's sort of how the male roles work in that opera.
Great answer, George. Why don't we mix it up a bit and have George ask me a question about one of these operas and how they show the formulaic nature of female representation in opera.
Okay, Alex, how about you compare the lead female roles in Madame Butterfly by Puccini and Salome by Strauss?
Well, interesting pairs, George. Well, I guess the main characters are both 15-year-old girls, and well, they have significant differences, even though they have the same character, essentially. And Madame Butterfly is actually about, it's a more pleading character, the girl. And once she finds out that her man has left her, she kills herself. And this is drastically different from Salome, because when the man doesn't want to kiss her, she orders him to be executed. And one can only wonder what specifically was the influence on Strauss to write this kind of character, which is a 15-year-old, and kind of how this affected this representation of women and their specific roles, and in relation to the opera and the entire story itself, and how different these two scenarios are, even though they're played by essentially the same character.
Great answer, Alex. It's some very interesting information. How about we compare the Magic Flute to the Marriage of Figaro?
Well, that's an interesting pair, George. Thank you for asking. Well, in fact, both of these operas are written by Mozart, and there are soprano arias in each of them, and coincidentally, they are both written in 6/8, and their tempo markings are adagio. But interestingly enough, they are played drastically different, and one can easily say they're played with a different mood in itself because of these different takes on the same exact tempo marking, essentially. And one can only wonder, one sounds more playful, more childlike, more this kind of brightness to the piece, and one sounds more, I guess, mature and actually kind of takes this adagio into the mood and into the character of the aria. And one can only wonder how the social status of women and the representation in opera affected either the performers of these arias and the specific voice types, or essentially why these arias were written and for what specific part Mozart was expecting in this character and this specific aria. So
that's a great answer, Alex.
Thanks. Now, thank you so much, George, for coming in and talking about the formulaic nature of women in opera and the representation of women, essentially, in opera in the 19th century. And it's definitely fun to explore the role of gender in opera and these specific characters and parts and storylines and how they differ from each other. And
yeah, it's been great fun. Hope to do it again.
See
Thanks
you guys.
for watching, girls.